I'm just going to record on my computer, and then we can delete if everyone has any concerns with regard to that. It will only be for the purposes of myself to maybe take notes after as well, or to forward on to those if permitted to those that couldn't attend. Okay, so again, with the funny housekeeping, I know we're all, as I said, well behaved, but we're going to be respectful and kind. Please respect others by being non-judgmental and by maintaining the confidentiality of the space. As I mentioned prior, I'm here at the LAMP office with one other colleague, Norky, and then there's a closed corridor here. So honoring the speakers and the group by staying present, and mute your video as well if you need to attend to something. Share the air by keeping your questions not too long. I know it's a really important topic, and we're going to probably really ask Anjala and probably Kate some really important questions that maybe we can't dive totally into tonight, but we could have follow-up. So if 1 or 2 per person would be possible, and again, a safe space for all attendees. So the meeting guidelines, again, we're going to breeze through this. We're going to try our best to make sure that everyone in the room is respectful, as mentioned. If there's a disruption, we'll remove any unwanted guests and proceeds with workshop. And fun note, the reason this is in there is because I once had a Zoom bomb and it took over a CBA meeting, and all of a sudden we had 38 people on the screen and we couldn't figure out how to do it. And they were well orchestrated, very bored individuals. So please introduce yourself, as we've already done in the chat box for anyone new, and maybe share the neighborhood you're living in. And we've gotten to that point. So if anyone hasn't, please feel free. Oops, oh dear. Oh dear, that's why we stay in the PDF zone. Okay. There we go. And then, so if you're calling in from the phone, I saw one individual. It's *6 to mute or unmute, and then *9 to raise your hand. That way we'll know if you have an important question, or feel free just to unmute yourself if it's appropriate, and we can talk then. Okay, and moving on. So a little bit of introductions. Again, my name is Vanessa Kiel-Vehar. I'm with Humber and LAMP and the C-Base, which is Community Benefits South Etobicoke specifically. My priority is environmental spaces and affordable housing. And so to introduce the others helping today, we have LAHAG speaker Kate O'Neill, LAMP health promoter Jasmine. Unfortunately, she won't be with us today because she is at the Daily Bread with the all candidates. And please welcome our guest speaker, Anjala K. I know, terrible. I try. Chft, FT and LT, as she was telling us, Land Trust Coordinator. So I will go ahead, and the purpose of this workshop, before we actually get to Anjala's presentation, which is coming up momentarily, is to gain a better understanding of how cooperative housing models operate, possible best practices that could be adopted in our ward to support the growth and expansion of the cooperative housing sector in South Etobicoke. And it's also to collectively brainstorm about feasible solutions. You know, we're all frustrated, we're all seeing inflation and all the things that are coming up as pain points. And also to engage with stakeholders from co-op agencies and organizations that are further ahead in this process and can assist our collective efforts, right? So I'm always very happy when I see knowledge sharing, because I think it's one of the most generous things that benefit everyone. Okay, so moving on. And to increase in the vulnerable senior sectors living in the private rental housing stock, we're seeing them being displaced into shelters in South Etobicoke. There's no housing security in the private rental market. Tenants are always vulnerable to escalating rent increases beyond what they can afford. The increase in families and low-income adults being evicted, so rent evictions, we've seen some even this week, unfortunately, and the increasing loss of affordable housing stock due to the commodification and investment return on housing properties and demolition. And specifically in South Etobicoke, we're looking at the huge developments of Christie sites, Van Dyke, but it's happening all over the city. And Anjala will be able to speak to that a lot better. Anjala, sorry. So now we have the lovely Kate, who's going to talk about LAHAG and what that stands for and their movements. And I'm going to move the slide up. I'll follow along with you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Vanessa. That's great. The Lakeshore Affordable Housing Advocacy and Action Group is a grassroots resident-led coalition and includes service providers, community organization, and community leaders working towards housing justice and housing equity in South Etobicoke. And we've been engaged in community development work in the housing issue for over 3 years. I actually think it's closer to 4, but COVID has really set everyone's dates in weird ways. We meet online the first Tuesday of every month through a Zoom meeting, but we're getting closer and closer to meeting in person. And it's really great when you go to one of these meetings in person, because LAMP is special. Every time you go to one of those meetings, the very first thing they do is they feed you. And that's how we get a lot of people to come into our meetings. But what does LaHague actually do? What's their mission statement? I need the next slide, or I can quote it off my own.
No.
I have it here. Our mission statement is to support our neighborhoods to locate, protect, and develop safe, secure, affordable housing. What does that mean? I mean, safe housing, want to develop safe housing. So the buildings themselves are safe. The buildings are clean, they're accessible. Secure meaning that once you get tenancy in the building, you are there until you want to leave. As long as you follow the rules and you pay your housing charges and all of that, you are secure in your housing. And affordable. Well, LaHague is working towards affordable, meaning 30% of your gross family income. So no more paying 50% of your income, no paying 70% of your income. It is based solely on your household income. And we now have a website. And actually, I'm very excited. I have to do one more thing in here. We got our first grant in April. And that's very exciting, because now we do have a project manager, and we have 2 people that we have hired for part-time work as community animators. And we have a website, www.lahague.ca. Very exciting, a really exciting name. I understand that, very exciting. And you can email us, info@lahague.ca, or get hold of Jasmine at LAMP. We want more people to join us. We need to hear more options. We need to hear more stories, because the way we learn and the way we grow is with community members' stories. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to move this up. And we are so pleased to have our guest speaker, Anjala, and she's coming with us from CHFT. She's the Land Trust Coordinator with the City of Toronto. She's been a mentor, a trusted source in the co-op housing space, and we're so pleased to have the knowledge sharing here with us today. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker. So I always say, Anjala, would you like to do a few words, because she can introduce herself better than I can in reading her bio. So
Sure. So thank
you.
you for that introduction. I want to thank Kate and Vanessa for inviting me to speak today and yesterday. So it was a great invitation. So my name is Anjala K, and I work as a land trust coordinator at the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto, and I've been doing that for a few years now. At the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto, we're primarily a member services organization, and we're just moving back into figuring out ways to develop new housing given the current political climate. So outside of my role as a land trust coordinator, prior to that, I was actually a member working on member services. So that's where I met people like Kate, who work or live in housing co-ops and are part of our membership and want to learn more about their co-op community and how to better support their co-op communities. So that's a little bit about me, but I think I should go straight into the presentation, because that's why people are here, and I don't want Kate to melt.
No melting. Thank you so much. I made you co-host. Is that okay, or do you want me to share?
No, that's fine. And if you can stop sharing, and then I will share my slides, if that's okay.
Exactly. No problem. Thank you.
Okay, so is that visible to everyone?
It is. I can see it. Yeah. It's just the same as me. You're on the left side. I didn't put mine into presenter mode. But if you're going to, otherwise I can see it.
Okay. Don't know what. Yeah, I'm looking forward to moving in person too, so I don't have to do all this again. Okay, so tonight I'll be speaking a little about co-op housing development, about our organization, about opportunities in South Etobicoke specifically, and what the current landscape is like. So for my agenda, I want to go briefly into, for many of you who may not know what CHFT is about, the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto, who we are. I also want to go into defining what kind of housing co-ops I'm talking about specifically, because I'm sure lots of people have heard about housing co-ops or co-ops in general, and they may just I want to focus in specifically on what type of housing I'm talking about. I'll go through a list of the developments in Ward 3 specifically, and our development record, what we've built, the trends around the development record. Also speak to the organization that I also work for, which is the Co-op Housing Land Trusts. And then finally reviewing a specific housing co-op model that we're now moving into, and then we'll take some questions. So if everyone's okay with that, I'll move on.
Thank you.
So what exactly is CHFT? Well, we're a membership-based organization. We serve approximately 170 to 180 housing cooperatives in the Durham, York, and Toronto area. And we are a cooperative ourselves with a board made of community members that live in our member co-ops. We represent over 40,000 members. And for the past 48 years, we've worked with co-op boards and service managers to promote and support the preservation of housing co-ops for our members. And also a lot of that work is very similar to La Hague in terms of advocacy. So there's a lot of action on our part, but with it, we're also huge advocates for maintaining current housing and also building new housing. So later on, I'll talk about actually our lesser known role, which is new development. So when we talk about housing co-ops, what exactly am I talking about? And yesterday I was talking about this as well. When we talk about cooperatives, people think about farming co-ops, they think about mountain equipment co-op, they think about condo co-ops, they think about equity co-ops. So there are a lot of different co-op ideas that people generally have, and not a very clear sense sometimes of what type of housing co-op or what type of co-op we're talking about. So housing co-ops, the ones that I'm referencing, are intentional communities with active member involvement. So it's a bunch of people or a group of people who intentionally organized, incorporated a co-op corporation, and have created bylaws. And so they're a legal association with a board of directors and members that live there that make decisions and vote about how the co-op should operate. At each housing co-op is a legal association, and the governing legislation is the Cooperative Corporations Act. And so that's a provincial legislation. And so a lot of times people living in co-ops confuse that with the Landlord-Tenant Act, which is not the same. So they have their own governance structure and their own legal responsibilities under a separate act provincially. And the purpose for housing co-ops is to be affordable and provide security of tenure. We want members to move in, and we want them, it's not just a temporary stay, it's to provide housing for low to moderate income people, and we want them to raise their families and retire there. It's a long-term tenure, security of tenure. So it's very different than supportive housing or traditional transitional housing. It's permanent housing. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm referencing housing co-ops. So housing co-ops have their own organizational structure, which is very different than other types of social housing that people are familiar with. So lots of parallels. When I speak to people, they have a lot of parallel thoughts between housing co-ops and things like Toronto community housing. Toronto community housing is public housing that's run by the City of Toronto through one of their corporations, and it's 100% rent geared to income. The tenants that live there don't have a vote, don't have a say in terms of their housing. In the co-op's context, every single co-op is an independent legal organization that has their own membership application, their own culture, their own community. And so there could be in South Etobicoke, for example, there could be co-ops along the same street, major street, and they have a very different way of running things and a different philosophy. So the internal structure of a co-op is that the members are the primary decision makers. And if you see in this structure, you see the housing co-op members are at the top of this hierarchy. They are the ones that vote to have a board of directors or elect their board of directors, who are other residents of the co-op who are members. So we have different language for co-ops as well. They're not people who live in co-ops. If they're members of the co-op, they're not tenants. Members of co-ops pay housing charges, not rent. They follow bylaws, not a lease. They have an occupancy agreement, not a lease. So it's very different than living in any other type of social housing. So the board of directors has officers like president, vice president, there's committees, and then the board of directors is also responsible for hiring staff. So that could be property management, that could be a housing co-op coordinator or co-op manager, and then the checks and balances for all of this is the auditor. So the auditor reports directly to the co-op members and happens every year on an annual basis. There's two meetings. They have an annual general meeting and a general members meeting where they elect the board of directors, but they also approve the financial statements. They approve the budget. So they're the ones that select the housing charges. And that's the co-op difference. So this is the organizational structure. So in Ward 3 specifically, I pulled some information from our data, and I wanted to clarify that this data is specifically from co-ops that are part of our membership. So we're a cooperative. We have nothing to do with how a co-op runs. They're all volunteer members because we follow the co-op principles. So if you have some time and you want to look into it, you can look up the International Cooperative Alliance, and there's principles that co-ops all over the world, no matter what type of co-op they are, have agreed to, and one of them is open and voluntary membership. So since CHFT is a cooperative, we follow that principle of wanting volunteer membership. So what happens in Ward 3 is these are the co-ops that are part of our members. So you'll see there's a number of co-ops in the area. 3 of them actually, if you see that have this asterisk here, they are part of our land trust. So we have 43rd Housing Co-op, Lakeshore Village Artist Co-op, and Robert Cook Co-op. And these are land trust co-ops, and I'll speak later on to what that actually means. But in total, from all the co-ops in Ward 3, we have about 1,018 housing co-op units. And you're getting this presentation after, so if people want to communicate with any of these co-ops and find out what's happening with them, you'll have this list and you'll be able to reach out. So earlier on, I spoke to how CHFT is a member services organization, providing support to co-op boards and also helping co-ops through their service providers or service managers negotiate agreements and things like that. But prior to us predominantly being a member services organization, we actually were in the business of development. So we are 48 years old. So if you go back and calculate when that period was, it's in the 70s that we were founded. And during that time, there were a number of resource groups that started to develop housing co-ops all throughout Ontario, not just specifically in Toronto. So you'll see I've organized the co-op, number of co-ops that were developed by decade. So you'll see in the 70s, we've had a few, 80s and 90s, and so on and so on. And there's a huge or sharp decline in the last 20 odd years. And that's unfortunate. So what you see from looking at this chart is there's an actual specific trend of when co-ops were developed and the political climate at the time. So where I've highlighted this section in red, you'll see from the 80s to the 90s, we've had a significant number of co-ops that we developed during this time. Time and time again, I get so many interested community groups who are going through what Vanessa earlier spoke about in terms of their missions, renovictions, prioritizing senior housing and needing supportive housing. And there are a lot of community groups that reach out to us and say, hey, we want to form a co-op as a solution to try to combat some of these problems of around the housing crisis. So why we haven't been able to produce the same number of units that we were producing back in the 80s and 90s is because in the 80s and 90s, there were specific government programs that were developed to not only build co-ops, but also fund them. So fund their operations and fund the subsidies for members so they could live there at affordable rates. So it was anywhere between deeply affordable rates that Kate talked about, so 30% of a household income, to CMHC's or Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, 100% market value for those units. And when these programs were cut in the 90s, you start to see a sharp decline in the number of co-ops that were built and the number of units that were being built. So even though you'll see 7 co-ops or 30 co-ops, the key to looking at how many co-ops were built or the trends in co-ops is actually the number of units. So in the 80s and 90s, because of the money that we received, we were able to build lots of co-ops and that had a number of units, 100 or plus units. And then in the latter decade, that has really declined, sharply declined. So there are smaller co-ops. After the hundreds of co-ops, hundreds of units, most of the co-ops we're seeing now are below 100 units that are being built, if at all. So in that time, in the 80s and 90s, what exactly did CHFT build? Because we were made up of a number of different resource groups, we were able to develop 45 new housing co-ops, and one of them is Local 75 Hospitality Workers, which is located right on Richmond Street, downtown Toronto, and it houses many hospitality workers who were prior to having this co-op being built, which is pegged as an architectural green energy building that Councillor Pam McConnell at the time really advocated for and believed in, and she's a strong advocate for co-op housing. So we were able to commit that project with city funding that she was behind at City Council to get other councillors supporting. And so there were a number of hospitality workers that were flooding that area or transiting from long commutes to work in the hotels and restaurants in the area or in Toronto. And then they would have to have long commutes back. So this actually solved a huge problem where people had a safe place to live, an affordable place to live, but it also has a training center for hospitality workers as well as part of its development. So that's a great co-op. So this was a new co-op we developed, but through acquisition, and this is what lots of people now when we get calls from are interested in. They have an old crumbling building with a landlord that hasn't really invested in the building, and they kind of want it to become a co-op or before there's renovictions that happen. So in the 90s when we started, we also acquired some properties and we developed 14 co-ops from existing properties. And an example I have here is City Park Housing Co-op, which is located in the gay and queer village of downtown Toronto. And there's 3 huge buildings in a really, really highly demanding area where people really like to be. Also affordable housing now. So those 3 buildings were put up for sale a number of different times. And we were successful in acquiring them, and this is a site that's actually part of one of our land trusts, and they house a number of different people, retired bureaucrats, but predominantly there was a stigma against people who have HIV or AIDS who couldn't find safe places to live and also wanted to stay in their communities. So a number of subsidies were committed to being provided to people that had that diagnosis and wanted to remain in the community. So we're really proud of that development as well. So some of these developments, even though we have 170 member co-ops, even though we were part of the development in the 80s and 90s, Only some of these co-ops are part of our co-op housing land trust, and that's really dependent on the resource group at the time and their philosophy around when they developed a project, whether it should be part of a land trust or not. So when I talk about our land trust, what exactly am I talking about? So we have what's called the co-op housing land trusts. It's actually an umbrella term. CHFT was responsible for administering these land trust agreements, and but there are a number of different land trusts given the resource groups that we had that were formed. So there's different corporations that all different corporations that co-ops were committed to in terms of being placed in a land trust. And for the ease of referencing them, we've just called them the co-op housing land trusts. Each co-op within the land trusts leases the land, the buildings, or both from one of our land trusts. And those agreements are typically 49 years. And after the 49 years, those co-ops remain in the land trust model so that other people we want to ensure that they're not put for private sale, or the members decide to do something else with the land or the property. So this is why they're in a land trust, so that we can guarantee in perpetuity that the housing is there for public good and the land is there for the public good and the public interest. So the CHLT ensures that when each co-op pays off their mortgage, the units remain in the sector, and we want future generations to enjoy the benefit of cooperative housing, because one of our strong principles around co-op housing is security of tenure. So when I talk about housing co-op models, earlier on I spoke specifically to what type of co-op I was referencing. So there's a clear independent organization. Everyone is a member of the co-op. They all pay housing charges. They vote and make decisions about the board of directors, their audited statements, their financial statements, anything related to their responsibilities, and it's an intentional community. But around the world, there are so many different types of cooperative housing models, and they're very flexible, and they take on many forms. And I'm going to talk about that in the next couple slides. The traditional model that we're familiar with, that I spoke about earlier, is that's the model that most of our, if not all of our co-ops that are part of our membership are subscribed to. So that's the model that I'm familiar with. But there's also other models, equity co-ops, where members actually have shares, for example. They also exist in Toronto, just not part of our membership. There's a lot of equity co-ops actually in British Columbia. So people pay a certain amount of money and to have an equity stake in the co-op community, and when they leave, they're entitled to take that money with them, or add more shares for a bigger unit, for example. So it's like a savings. It's similar to an options for home if we're trying to think about it that way, but not exactly, because it's still a housing co-op. Then there's a nonprofit co-ops, which I've talked about. Those are the traditional co-ops that we all know. Seniors co-ops, also part of our membership. So we have a few, 2 or 3 of them that their membership is very specific. So even though co-op principle is open and voluntary membership, if it says specifically and they've received mandated status to have a specific group that they support, then that co-op can accept amounts only from that group. So these seniors co-ops one seniors co-op has members that are only 55 years or plus, and those are the only people that they'll accept applications from. And then we also have co-ops within our membership that are artist co-ops. So they're supporting artists throughout their careers. And so sometimes artists will have a great project, so they'll get a lot of income for that project, and their housing charges will reflect that income. And then there are times where they don't have funding coming in or didn't receive a grant, and so their housing charges become deeply affordable. So there's also those types of co-ops that are within our membership. So we are now moving towards a different type of model, and there's a number of reasons why we're moving towards a different type of model. First, when I showed you earlier in our development record, in the 80s and 90s, there's no trick or magic to co-op housing development or any type of housing development. Without government support, it's really, really challenging to build anything, which is why you see a number of condos being developed, but you don't see a number of social housing providers or social housing being developed. Because if the government does not provide, it doesn't have a program, then we really have little options to build. So when the governments did have programs, we were able to land bank. We could buy a piece of land and hold on to it until we committed a project to develop a housing co-op on that piece of land. The mortgage was affordable. You know, with the rising costs in Toronto, we can't even afford to just take out a mortgage and sit on a piece of land because we can't afford the land anymore without a government program. The other part of our development record I spoke to was the rental assistance, the subsidies that members received and the co-op received for their operation. So whatever, as a nonprofit, the co-op is affordable because it doesn't have huge housing charge revenues. And so members are able to pay for their housing charges, and their housing charges remain affordable because of that, because they had the operating subsidy and the rent supplements or rental subsidies. That program also, it was gone, and we don't have that anymore. That 49 years, 50 years agreements, we're not seeing anymore. There's temporary assistance, which is why you see a lot of initiatives being announced for supportive housing or transitional housing or rooming houses, things like that. But you don't see new development projects for co-op housing, which is long-term tenure, because governments are not in the business anymore of developing new housing. So when the 90s, those programs were cut, the federal government exited developing new housing, and also the provincial government offloaded the programs onto the service managers. So there's 50 plus service managers in Ontario. So the City of Toronto is a service manager, the City of Mississauga is a service manager, York, all of these different places are different service managers, and they ended up having to take all of the social housing provider stock and then administer it themselves or manage it themselves. And there were already lots of service managers, including the City of Toronto, were already in a deficit position and having challenges managing their own housing. So you can see why so much of the housing stock we have now is maybe not in the best shape. So the new model I'm talking about is just a response to the current climate. So in 2012, we had a number of sector leaders. So we have very committed, thoughtful people that work in the housing sector who, if they moved on to the private sector, would make a lot of money, but they're very committed to housing co-ops and the idea of housing co-ops, and they sat down and tried to figure out what's a new model of housing that we can build, and also the relationships that we have with politicians, how can that be helpful to us? So MP Adam Vaughan at the time, he is a strong advocate and believer of co-op housing, and he has a very strong relationship with my executive director, Tom Clement, who has an amazing record and reputation with developing housing co-ops and managing housing co-ops and advocating for housing co-ops. He wanted to ensure that a new Tridel development in Toronto, that there was a community benefit that directly was a housing co-op. So when I talk about community benefit, if any of you have gone to City of Toronto development meetings, community benefits could be things like a dog park or a playground or a rooftop garden or a parkland. And we wanted to make sure that when there is a community benefit, that it is housing co-op units. So I actually got 12 units from the 65-story downtown Toronto condo. So first we incorporated a land trust, the Naismith Land Trust, which has its own board. And then in this model, what we've done is we're creating divisions in this model. So every time there's a new condo development, if we can successfully advocate for that condo development to give the city and subsequently us, the co-op units, then we want to add more divisions. So the first division we have is 10 York Street, and that's a Naismith nonprofit housing. And it's a Tridel development. We received 12 units. And for those 12 units, we ran a lottery system to see who would end up living there to occupy those units. And we received over 1,000 applications. And this was in 2018 when the building was, the lower floors of the building were ready for occupancy. So in 2018 and 2019, the new members of those units moved in. But based on the number of applications we received, we know that there's a huge housing crisis. In the 80s and 90s, a single person could move into a one-bedroom or studio apartment co-op. They may need a partner or want a roommate, and they could move to another co-op and get a two-bedroom. They may have children and then move to another co-op or stay in their co-op and transfer to a three-bedroom, and then they could retire, or if there's someone who's retiring, they could move back down to a studio. There was an ease of movement because there were so many units available at the time, and now we don't see that at all. There are no units available. All of our co-ops have little to no vacancies. During the pandemic, there's been no movement. So there's a huge crisis. So we want to respond to that crisis. So we see the Naismith Land Trust as the new model where we're actually partnering with the private sector and the City of Toronto and trying to get turnkey units that are already being developed in areas that all of our members live in. Low and moderate income people live downtown Toronto, and they live in North York. They live all over the City of Toronto. So we want to make sure there's housing for them, similar to the hospitality workers who had to leave the city for their affordable housing and then drive back into the city or take transit into the city to actually serve the hospitality industry in downtown. So it's a vehicle for growth. We're hoping to acquire new buildings. We're also hoping that there's some co-ops that are projects in difficulty, and if we can help them by moving them into this land trust model, we're hoping to do that as well. And also advocating, so letting the City of Toronto know, hey, we are able to take on additional condo units like as an option. So it's no longer just the traditional co-op builds. So when I talk about opportunities for growth, I'm not just talking about the Naismith model for us. I'm also talking about recently some announcements that have been in our favor, in the co-op housing favor specifically. We talked about this yesterday with the group we had, but a lot of these service providers, we end up competing with one another because there are not many, I don't know of any nonprofit developers. We don't develop housing. We partner with developers who, at the time when there was government programs, we were able to pay through those government programs. But because they've all been canceled or they've been watered down, we haven't had that opportunity. So the National Housing Strategy and CMHC's co-investment fund has been the largest source right now for trying to commit smaller projects or take on smaller co-op builds, even though it's actually less expensive and better use of our time to build bigger co-ops like we were doing back in our heyday. So recently the federal budget announced that there would be a specific co-op housing development program that would run through our national organization, which is the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada. And so it's $500 million in grant funding for all of Canada for projects that co-ops currently want to develop and are thinking about developing. And that money may run out quickly. There's also $1 billion in loan, things like that. But this is a start. We're hoping that there'll be more money committed to those to our sector in general. So there are a couple of resources that I think if people are interested in co-op housing and the new models of co-op housing, that I think if you go online and Google, you can get lost in the weeds and go down a rabbit hole and then end up, like I've done many of times, I go at work to look at something around land trust, because now there's a huge buzzword around land trust, but our land trust is actually one of the biggest in North America, and it's one of the oldest in North America, and we don't really talk about it because it wasn't considered innovative at the time. It was just considered something we wanted to preserve housing with by using a land trust. But now there's a lot of buzz around community land trusts and land trusts in general. So I've done some Googling and then end up hours and hours in a YouTube, Google rabbit hole. So for the purposes of our group today, and it's a very focused discussion around South Etobicoke and new models, I pulled two resources that I think would be really helpful for people who want to look into this more. One of them is just about co-op housing. So Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has a really good guide that's called the Co-op Housing Guide that people can download, and people within our sector and other co-op housing sector workers around Canada contributed to the development of that guide. And then the other one is the new housing models. That's what the publication is entitled, and it's a really great study of all the different types of models available throughout the world. So in that study, you'll hear about Germany and Denmark that are really progressive in developing cooperative housing, and it's the primary vehicle for social housing in those countries. And there's also an assessment of Canada, and then the equity model and other similar shared living models are in that study, and it was done by R.A. Malatest and prepared for CMHC. So it's buried in the Google searches, but it's a really good publication for people that are interested. So that's all from me that I wanted to share with all of you in terms of South Etobicoke co-ops that we have, a little about CHFT, our land trust model, the new development that we're creating with Naismith. Oh, there is one more thing I wanted to talk about Naismith. The difference is in Naismith, the 10 York division, those 12 families that live there, they do not make up the board of directors. So in a traditional co-op, as I mentioned earlier, the residents that live there actually vote for the board of directors and the president and the vice president, who then go on to hire staff and deal with any membership issues like arrears, for example. In this model, the Naismith Land Trust is the board of directors, and then we add a division, and then each division eventually will have one person from that division added to the board of directors, so that we can ensure there's more of a portfolio approach. It's not insular to the co-op alone, but also if there's a number of, we've had co-ops around for a very long time, and we want to make sure if there's governance issues or management issues, that there's a sector approach to those issues and that it doesn't just fester at the co-op level. So that's why we've created this new model. Okay, so now I'm officially done with all the things that I wanted to say, and I can take any questions or comments if people have any.
That was so informative. Thank you so much. I'm always amazed with, and you're right, that rabbit hole, that is like a slippery slope for even people not in the sector like myself. I'm like, oh, there's so much. So I have a couple of questions. I see Mark's hands up. Also, I believe it's Irene, but there's just the first one that presented itself in the chat for you is, it says, is the co-op housing for people with disabilities? And I just said, I can ask, I think it's specific to the actual property, but I don't know. So I know they exist, but yeah.
Yeah, Vanessa, you're right. So again, when people think about co-op housing, sometimes they equate it with Toronto community housing and a centralized wait list and going through that process. It's not like that. Because each co-op is an independent organization, they have their own application process, and they also have their own style or types of units. Some co-ops are small, old Victorian townhouses. Other co-ops are big apartment buildings, and we have everything in between. So there could be a co-op with 10 units, there could be a co-op with 100 units. In those mix of units, there are some co-ops that have accessible, like truly barrier-free accessible units. And so you could go on our website and do a search of your area specifically and see. Those units are really challenging to come by because there's unfortunately, very few of them. And there's usually a wait list from someone within the co-op because people live in the co-op for a long period of time. Someone who requires, and I'm talking about physical disability. Sorry, I know
that was my impression too. I understand there are many other invisible and absolutely encompassing all disabilities and abilities, but I was also thinking that the barrier to access for mobility, yes.
Yeah, so mobility and co-ops, and this is another challenge co-ops are facing, is trying to become barrier free or retrofit their units so people can actually age in place. It's a huge problem for many co-ops who, when they were built, didn't have that problem, and now those founding members want to stay in the co-op and they can't do the walk up anymore. So yeah.
Sense. Thank you. Mark, would you like to go? And then I believe whomever's on the phone next, the hand is up. So Mark, you're first.
Yeah, thank you. Anjala, thank you so much. This has been very insightful. I just had a question on, do you have resources for case studies of financing the co-ops in Ontario in like very, very detailed, specifics? I'm involved in, I have an understanding of finance, and I'm just very curious about like, going through how co-ops can get a mortgage, like how, like what type of terms they might be able to get, and anything that that you can provide. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have anything I think that's recent, but there is something from, and I'll send this to Vanessa so she can send to everybody. I do have a development resource from CHF Canada that I could share, just general information. But I also have John Harstone, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, has been a huge advocate for and dedicated his entire life to developing nonprofit and supportive housing. And he was the founding executive director of St. Clair's Multi-Faith Housing. He has been in the co-op sector for a long time and developed a primer for co-op development that is from the 90s. But I read it, I've been reading stuff, and it's still relevant in terms of the numbers. You just have to inflate them, but in terms of how to get a project committed, because a lot of the projects, even that I talked about today, were because of him. So I can share that as well. It's very detailed in terms of the programs that existed, and it has the financial information there as well. It just may require some inflation. Like I said, there's no magic. The formula remains the same. So I'll share those resources, Mark.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mark. What a good question, actually, because I'm always interested in those pathways as well. And I believe, is it Irene? Are you on the phone?
Yes.
Hi.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hi.
Go ahead with your question.
Look, maybe it's me being a little foggy-minded. Unlike Mark, I don't have a good foundation in economics, but my background is history, and I'm just a little concerned because, of course, we're seeing very rapid inflation coming, which is what brought about the housing crisis and the crash in, I think it was around the late 1980s, early 90s. And, like that was for a lot of reasons. We had the problem with Quebec searching the possibility of Quebec going independent. There was a recession in Canada's main trading partner in the States. Canada had low commodity prices and a large national debt and deficit that was weakening the value of the Canadian dollar. At that time, if I remember correctly, it actually caused a crash. And I lived through that period, and people were literally walking away from houses that they had basically had a good chunk of money put in. They couldn't afford the mortgage because of rising inflation that the government had introduced earlier in the 80s, late 80s. And so the only thing they could do was literally just shut the door and walk away. And I know I suffered with a possibility of having to do something like that myself. What I'm asking is, what is the funding foundation for the co-ops? Is it the Canadian federal government, Ontario? Where are the resources? Because banks since then have, even though now they're, if you say the word co-op, it's about the only thing the banks will support. Most of our industries have, as a result, moved to other countries, even if it's a very sound idea. Where I'm a little concerned that something like that happens again. And where would that leave someone who's trying to start up a co-op? Does that make sense, or am I totally messing everything up?
No, it makes sense. And like, the question you're asking is what lots of people, when they call us, ask. They want to start a co-op, and how? Similar to Mark's question. And I tried to address that in the presentation, saying it's not a magic formula. It's the government program. So some co-ops are municipally funded. So they're funded through the City of Toronto when the province downloaded their housing responsibilities onto the service manager. Some co-ops are federally funded through CMHC programs at that time in the 90s. So they had different programs, all provided rent supplements or rental assistant and operational subsidies.
Right, now, and I want to mention, by the way, that in the 90s, you saw a rapid deflation in terms of the cost of housing. So it's great that they were able to grab a lot of the properties at that time.
Right. And so I think I spoke to that in terms of acquisition, right? That was something that we were able to do, where there was buildings that were put up for sale and we could get them at a decent price and get a government program to rehab them. So we are not seeing that funding now. The co-investment fund through the National Housing Strategy that the federal government announced, I think in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, is something members or residents interested in can apply to. It's just it's a very challenging application process. And when you are developing a co-op, it requires an equal or more participation from the city at the time. So if you're in Sudbury and you want to develop a co-op and you get co-investment funds, it's contingent on you getting the city of Sudbury's, the municipality of Sudbury to agree. So this is the challenge. This is why we're not CHFT as an organization that started with a number of resource groups committing projects is not in that business. We're predominantly trying to see how do we maintain our existing stock, because a lot of our existing co-ops are in bad, sometimes in bad capital in shape. And also, because my job right now as a land trust coordinator is looking at the co-ops. So there's 32 co-ops within our land trusts, and they represent approximately 4,000 members. They're not all in Toronto. They're in different places, not all part of our membership. So how do I look at the existing co-ops and see, is there surplus land? Is there land that we already owned that's half the battle that we can now get a government program to actually build? Even with the land, we are still having a challenge trying to figure out how to build on a site because we don't see the government programs there. So that's why this new program that that the Liberal government just announced the co-op housing development program that I referenced earlier on. It's new. It was just announced in the federal budget. We're hoping that's a way for us to streamline through the government funds and get projects that we know that we can build if we just get government support. So that's my long way of saying it's really challenging. And if we knew how to do it, we would be doing it.
Right. I understand. And this, what happens with the funds? You said it started, was it in 2017? Was that the date you mentioned?
Which funds? The federal government's national housing strategy?
Yes, the federal government one.
Yeah, I've lost track of time. Kate, I'm in your boat. Like, I don't know what time.
I'm sorry. I'm probably taking too much time. I do apologize for that.
So what happened with the national housing strategy is that there were a lot of challenges in groups trying to get the funds. It wasn't just for co-ops. It was for nonprofits, transitional housing, rapid housing, every type of housing nationally. So this is why I think the government has now changed, or trying to change the program to be more focused on specific needs so that we're not competing with one another. So now this is a co-op housing program. We don't know how it's going to work because the funds are going to flow, we think, through the National Co-op Housing Federation. And once we figure that out, then we will be able to commit some projects. But the Rapid Housing Initiative is available as well. So the National Housing Strategy has a number of different streams.
So is this a chunk of money that was increased on a yearly basis? Like if a certain amount of money is committed and say it is not awarded, does it stay in the till with an additional amount added to it?
I'm not sure. I wish someone here from Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation could speak to this, but I wouldn't be able to answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay, because I thought I heard somewhere that the problem was that a lot of the money had not been allocated and it sort of just gets frittered away elsewhere. Again, my apologies. I've taken up a lot of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your insightful questions. Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions, Irene. I know that's one of the dangers we have with having such a knowledgeable guest is we all want to ask the questions and like really get to the meat and bones, or whatever that silly phrase is, of the responses. I imagine it's funny, there probably wouldn't be so much money like laying around going to waste. So I find that very hard to believe. But I just wanted to address, there were a couple individuals that joined us graciously, but a little bit late. And I was wondering if you could readdress the fact that they're asking like in the chat, just questions about, for example, how long is the co-op wait list, and what to do, how do we do this? And then like, you know, for example, it was specific to, I think, the co-ops, but if you could just briefly address how to get on a co-op list. And then Karen Elstone has asked, is there anything I can do regarding the co-op where I live that is the co-op is substandard? So there's like probably two questions, and I can go in and read the last one, but maybe the first part, how do we get on a co-op in the first place, and what's the wait list like?
Yes, and before that, there was somebody who wanted to get the resources for my last slide. So what I did was I copied and pasted it into the chat, so they could just click on the links.
And I will send that out now that we're finished. There's two parts, your resource slide, and then also you sent me something yesterday. That's a great resource.
Okay, and in terms of the wait list, each co-op manages its own affairs and has its own waiting list. So we have nothing to do with that. CHFT is a membership-based organization. The co-ops voluntarily are part of our membership and pay our organization member dues, and we provide services to the co-op, whether that's board support or helping with tendering or helping with their communications with the federal or municipal government. And that's the extent of our work with the co-op. We don't have a centralized waiting list, and this is why I was doing the parallel, or making the parallel between Toronto Community Housing, which does have its own centralized wait list, and that's the only way you can get into any of the Toronto Community Housing buildings. Co-ops are their own organizations. They could be two co-ops side by side, and their applications look completely different. Because their membership is volunteer with us, we don't have an updated database. We do have online all the co-ops that are part of our membership, and we try our best to post when they have a vacancy. And then it's up to the person when they see that vacancy posted to apply directly or contact the co-op directly if they're interested. There isn't a centralized wait list that we manage, and then you can call the co-op and ask if they're accepting applications, if you're cold calling, for example. If you're having issues with your co-op, I do not work as a co-op advisor. That's not my role. There are 4 co-op advisors. If the co-op advisors have given you advice, and this is the gift and the curse of a co-op, co-ops are independent organizations. Members vote on who represents them. And if you have what you feel like a board that doesn't represent your interests, or they're not making the investment that they should be making, then I would encourage you to run for the board and try to get elected so you have a say. Because they're democratic organizations, we don't interfere in how a co-op is runs unless the service manager or the federal government asks us to for whatever reason, and that's going to be a huge threshold before they ever ask us to help as well. So if you are having an issue, and I'm really sorry to hear that, I would say that you would have to write a letter to your board of directors, and then or meet with the board of directors and deal with that issue internally using your co-op bylaws and speaking with your staff.
Mhm. Those are really good, like, advice, things like run on your own. It's frustrating, Karen. That seems like you've done all the right steps and aren't getting anywhere. I just wanted to sort of touch base. We have about, let's see, we have about 20 minutes left. I'm not sure if people still have some questions, but in the beginning, and I know yesterday you talked about, okay, these are maybe some of the challenges and the barriers we're seeing. And obviously there are all those units built. And then not only were there no government subsidies for the builds, no government subsidies for, you know, people actually, the clients living there. So it's a double-edged sword. What do we do now? And just maybe like sort of a ballpark answer. I mean, Kate's doing all this great work, you know, some other agencies here, there's so much great work being done. How do we really sort of like not doom and gloom, but like, how do we move forward when it seems really overwhelming?
Okay, so the number one thing, and I've told Kate this when she's called and been really frustrated about, hey, there's something getting built here and it's a private developer and it should belong to the public, which I completely agree. It's public investment in areas that are now in high demand. It's because of the public, so it should remain in the public good. The first thing I say is if you're in a building and you're thinking we want to form a co-op, you need to make sure everyone else in the building, or at least the majority of the people in that community, also agree. So if you would have to do some community organizing inside of your residence first. And once you have a group going or join a group that already exists, then there could be a solution to the issue that you presented. Is it pooling our funds or applying for funds to buy our building? And yesterday someone had that question. And unfortunately, you know, the market is really, even with inflation and the prices dropping for housing, it's still very expensive. So if you can negotiate with your landlord and see, as a group, could you purchase it, get a mortgage? That would be something to do, but it has to be a unified voice.
Okay.
The second thing that I would do is always talk to your local city councilor who approves development at city council. That is number one. If you have a community meeting, go to the community meeting and talk about prioritizing housing. The unfortunate part is that all of these different service organizations we're competing with one another. So I could show up to a meeting and then a supportive housing organization shows up to a meeting and they're also advocating for supportive housing, or an artist organization shows up and say we need to house our artists. So I would try to kind of, and this is what La Hague is doing, and some other organizations are doing in your area already. So don't repeat the work. Try to join those organizations and have a bigger voice. This happened, if you want to look at an example, this happened with Build a Better Bloor.
Yep.
Bloor and Dufferin area, the local community who had all different stakeholders in one group successfully lobbied the city of Toronto, the developer, to build, or not to build what they wanted to originally build, but also provide them with funds so that they can actually build affordable housing somewhere else as well. So you want to have a united voice, and so knowing what's happening on the ground in your community is really important. So talking to your city councilor, finding out organizations that already exist, going to their community meetings. Co-op housing may not be the solution. Maybe in that area you need transitional housing. Maybe you need to buy scattered homes and create some sort of land trust that way. So it's not just a banner of affordable housing. It's a very specific prescribed type of housing that you need, and only you will know that because you know the needs of your community. So that's the two streams that I would say. The political advocacy, even though there were programs in the 80s and 90s, and now we're seeing another program, they only exist because we mobilized nationally as a co-op housing sector and forced the government to introduce those programs. And so you also have that ability too with your numbers as well. So those are the options. But again, I say if we thought we could do it, or we know that we could do it, we would have already done it. So there's no magic. If the money is not there, you don't have a singular resident's voice, and you find out from people in your building that they're not interested in co-ops, then it's better to join a group and figure out, okay, what's our next step? If my building gets sold, is there something in the neighborhood that we could build so that we can move into?
Yeah, that's really smart. I like how you sort of address to like joining forces. Don't reinvent all these things. And yeah, BBD, they're doing a lot of good work, and there's so many people doing the great work. And I think that that's really important. And sometimes we just don't know about it or what to do. And there are a couple of questions I just want to address in the chat because Chris hasn't had a voice yet. He's asking about rent geared to income. Will that apply if for co-op? And I don't believe it will, but that's different. I think maybe you should answer that. Can you get an RGI if it was available and be in a co-op?
Yeah. So co-ops are mixed income communities. So that centralized wait list that the city of Toronto has, some co-ops, not all co-ops, because some were formed under a federal program, some were formed under a provincial program. The ones that were formed or developed during the provincial programs, when they were downloaded to the service managers, the city of Toronto now is responsible for them.
Okay.
So whenever there's a subsidy a vacancy for a subsidized unit, the co-op is obligated to take someone off the Housing Connections wait list, the same waiting list that Toronto Community Housing uses. So that is a rent geared to income unit, but not all co-ops have rent geared to income. But yeah, you can live in a co-op and receive rent geared to income.
Wonderful. And then the next hand up I see is Mark, and then I believe Irene is next if anyone has some questions too. So Mark, please go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious if you mentioned that there was a few people that you worked with who had specific who were involved with the creation of the land trust programs in terms of structuring it in a way that would make it feasible to. I'm just wondering, like, would I be able to, or would one be able to reach out to those people to chat more about it if I have any questions after I've read through the primer that was given, or that you said you would send out, and I'll give you the reason I'm interested. I've been working on essentially a template for how to build a Begruppen, or the German housing in Toronto and Canada. So I'm and essentially there's options as well in kind of a co-development or a Begruppen model where I could see like just the many people providing their own equity to the project, and so that would kind of unlock a little bit more cash. So there might be other options here, and I'm just that's something I'm curious about.
Yeah, so the person I would want you to speak to, unfortunately, is my dear colleague who passed away. He is very, very, John Harstone, very familiar with all of the different housing models all over the world. What we can do, Mark, is you can read the things that I send out, and maybe you and I can talk, and I'll figure out maybe who's best to speak to. Most of those sector leaders have moved on, or are lawyers, or unfortunately have passed away. And it may be a good or bad thing, but I may be your best bet. So how about we connect after you look at things together, like look at through the stuff, and then we can talk, and then maybe I'll figure out if there's someone else that you could connect with, like David Hilchansky, for example.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Mark, but there's a few of us in this group that are interested in alternative models as well. And Holchansky, we've invited to some talks, and I think that's amazing. Maybe we could start another group as a side note on other things. There's so much good work done.
He actually lived in so the sector leaders I'm talking about all lived in co-ops, and that's including David Hilchansky. So they have a strong they have a soft spot for co-op housing, and they're believers of it because they lived in it. So, yeah.
Okay. I believe, is there anyone? 2 participants have their hands up. I'm not sure, Mark, or is that yourself just from the last question? And I believe, Irene, your hand is up. And if anyone else has the question, be next in line, no problem. We still have a couple minutes, but being mindful of the time, it is 20 after. And so I'd like
I just wanted to sorry, Vanessa, I just wanted to clarify something. That question about rent geared to income in co-ops,
yes,
you still have to apply to, you have to be on the Housing Connections list in order to get into the co-op. So when you're applying for Housing Connections, if you're looking for rent geared to income, you have to choose a co-op as an option, because they have a list of options, and then the co-op goes through the list, and they're obligated to take the top, whoever's at the priority, and that's the way you would get in. But you couldn't apply to the co-op and then ask for and try to get a rent geared to income.
Chris, does that answer your question a little clearer? If you can come on mic, or you can just put your hand up or say yes.
Yes, he said yes in the chat. Yeah, I was just reading again what he was saying.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because
they want to lead anyone astray. Yeah.
No problem. So there is one hand up. Irene, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead with your question, and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up, just being mindful of time. And then we can do some next steps. Irene, your hand is up. Do you have a question, or is that from just before?
That was from before. Thank you, Vanessa. But I think I've taken up so much time already. I'll let somebody else have the floor. But thank you.
No problem. I'm glad your question was answered. I know it's really tricky to get so much great information and good learning in. And with this rich discussion, I just wanted to invite those that potentially haven't had a chance to say anything yet. If there's a question they want to bring up, I know that there are a lot of sort of different responses as to how do I get on the list? How do I, how do we make this work? Some financial questions. So Jasmine, please go ahead. I see your hand up.
Sorry, I'm coming in late. We just had an all candidates meeting at Daily Bread Food Bank for the riding, so that apologize for being late. But I did want to ask a question, and I'm not sure if it was asked before, but I'm just wondering if we're hearing things through the grapevine that there might be some co-op opportunities coming up through the grapevine, through the pipes, and I know it's hard to speak to things that haven't been announced, but I'm just wondering if you know anything, or if there's anything that Etobicoke Lakeshore can do to take advantage of any of this to sort of get a little bit of a head start.
Okay, so I am not part of the grapes nor the vine, so I'm not completely sure, but I did speak to a new, in the federal budget, there's a specific program for co-ops, co-op development, and it's targeted to co-ops that already have projects that are that they're working on or are about to commit. So what I would say is, in your ward, I do have that list. If there are any co-ops that are interested in new development, maybe talking to them about being able to get those funds, because from my understanding, it's very preliminary. I'm not sure about it. All the details of the program haven't come out yet, and CHF Canada, the national organization, is working on that. They're the ones that are going to be receiving the funds and then distributing it to different co-ops nationally. And so if you can already get a project on the go, or do the feasibility around a project, so when that does come up, you can apply. But my understanding right now is that it has to be an existing co-op, or if you want to develop a co-op, I think they're prioritizing infill development right now. Or
So if we had a couple of co-ops that had a lot of land,
yeah,
that probably could, we got a few of them in our community that have a lot of land and probably are at the stage where they really have to start thinking about, maybe we should try to talk to them and see if we can
yeah, of course,
come up with something. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but don't hold my grapes or vine accountable for anything that I just said, FYI.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was just about to ask if I can steal that line. I'm not part of the grapes nor the vines. I giggled out loud. That was a good one. It's a polite way of deferring, like, I can't answer that.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else that maybe didn't have a question answered that would like to? I know we've had, as I said, a pretty rich discussion, but there's a lot of information here and a lot of really good resources. And I appreciate the fact that not only did we do a bit of a deep dive into the co-ops and it was very specific and targeted, but that there are some resources that, yes, things might seem overwhelming and daunting, but with people behind them that sort of really come together, it is absolutely possible. You know, you just hear so much about wait lists and things like that. It's overwhelming for people that don't want to feel discouraged. So I can't thank you enough, Anjala. Is it Angela or Anjala? I want to be corrected.
Oh, it's Anjala.
Anjala. So
Yeah.
Neither. Okay. I don't like mispronouncing names, so I try to get it right.
I've been called things worse, so I'm okay with the mispronunciation.
No worries. Jasmine, I see your hand is up again, please. Is that
Just a couple of things, if I could just make a couple of quick announcements. One is that, both La Hague is continuing to do work, great work and affordable housing and looking at all these opportunities. So if anyone's interested, please get in touch with La Hague or get in touch with me and we'll get you all hooked up. And that the Humber Research Project is leading a housing conference that we're all going to be working on. So again, if you're interested in working on a housing conference for the local area in South Etobicoke, please let us know. We're doing some exciting things and that we'll be having some more workshops. We're doing two types of workshops. We're doing workshops on housing. So, we talked about rent assist, we're talking about co-ops, we're talking about land trusts, we're talking about all kinds of great things that you might be interested in. We're going to have the manager from the city who's in charge of the RGI, which is Rent Geared to Income program, back with us. So if you're interested in that, please let us know, because there's some really great information there on the new system that's going on in Toronto. So we'll be doing that. And then on the other side of the coin, we're also all together, La Hague, the Humber Project, and as well LAMP are also working on, I'm going to enter somebody because, sorry, okay, thank you. Sorry. So we're also working on another type of series, workshops that are very exciting around leadership. And I'm not sure if you talked a lot about it, but we did one on strengths-based leadership. We did one on some other opportunities in leadership, and we're trying to sort of unify the community and seize the momentum and get the energy going. So we hope you'll really get involved, and a small way, even if you have a small interest, even if it's attending a meeting or going to an all candidates meeting or helping out in the barbecue, all good. Any little small gesture helps us to do our great work. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I see there's a question in the chat here, or maybe not a question. Max says, how can I get the recording of this? Well, Jasmine, who just came, I've actually recorded this meeting on her LAMP account. So when that's rendered, I will ask her to forward it. And then in addition to that, we'll have the presentation from both of them, both sides, and also another resource that's been provided for us from our lovely host, our guest speaker. So we will be providing after this meeting. I will send it out later tonight, if not early in the morning, to everyone that attended and all those that registered, because those resources are valuable valuable. And then what I will do is also tag in the housing conference Jasmine talked about and ways to get involved with that. That's the 29th, and it's going to still be virtual because we're going to expect that people will be coming. And also the leadership workshops that she's talking about, as she said, any strength. I did one on empathy and support. So there's any type of leadership. We're looking to really grow the movement around everything to do with affordable housing, community involvement in any way. There's not a silly response. There's absolutely nothing, but please send us any of the contacts, your messages. So again, I'm going to put up LAHAG and LAMP, and then Jasmine's email is also in there. Mine you have from all the messaging that I've been sending out to you. And thank you all for being patient with all the Eventbrite and the Zoom links and everything like that going forward. I think it's always one of those tech things, but I'm very grateful that you're all here. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now. And then if there's any further questions or anything you'd like to maybe ask or you didn't get a chance to do, please go ahead and do so now.